It is deeply unnatural for a human to hurl himself from great heights, and much more so to do it in the middle of a dark, bullet-filled sky in wartime, where the paratrooper is, for agonizing minutes, nothing more than an unarmed, vulnerable target. The volunteer soldiers who have done just this, successfully through many wars, arguably form a whole separate species of warrior. Air assault is the most mobile form of warfare. From humble beginnings after World War I, it became the most fearsome and effective method of inserting troops into battle during the Second World War. In Vietnam, air assault was developed into the air mobile concept. The arrival of the Huey helicopter allowed air cavalry troops to be dropped right into action in the Southeast Asian jungles. In the present day, the high mobility of airborne forces enables them to deploy practically to a trouble spot anywhere in the world at very short notice. Indeed, airborne forces form the spearhead of the rapid reaction forces of many nations around the world. Says one U.S. Army commander.
We can project a force any place in the world and start making that projection of that force within 24 hours of the president's decision. That in itself is a deterrent.
The modern air assault force and its awesome equipment and capability have become such an integral part of warfare that it seems to have been always in place. Only the men actually involved know that only a constant, remorseless expenditure of sweat and care can give that appearance. They know that the art of plunging from the air will punish any instant of carelessness with a swift, awful death. In no other machine of war is dependence on others so critical. And in no other is attention to mind-numbing detail so vital to survival.
Then the number 2 jumper will secure the jumper's left leg strap and trace its entire length, making sure, of course, it's not twisted, cut, or frayed, misrouted over the saddle, and then route it from rear to front between the jumper's legs, sounding off the left leg strap.
Left leg strap.
The number 1 jumper will secure the left leg strap with one hand, and with his other hand, he will trace its entire length for himself.
To a paratrooper, the arduous task of checking and rechecking equipment is literally his lifeline.
The jump master must place his hands in exactly the same spot every time. His eyes never more than 6 inches away from his hands, looking for any abnormality in the rigging of that parachute or the jumper's equipment.
After the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America was now plunged into war. Fort Bragg, North Carolina became the home of an airborne command that had just 60 planes. In July 1942, 2 classic airborne divisions, the 82nd All-American and the 101st Screaming Eagles, were activated. The fledgling U.S. airborne forces did not have to wait long to see action. On November 8, 1942, American forces landed against the Vichy French government in North Africa. Despite much heroism, they contributed little of substance to the eventual German defeat. But they would get a fast opportunity to turn their luck around in Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. The plan was to drop 2 American and 2 British paratroop units to block roads from German reinforcements. The problem was the huge, trigger-happy Allied invasion fleet sitting nervously in the dark near the approach routes. 23 American airplanes loaded with paratroopers were shot down by American gunners. It would get worse. Glider pilots cut loose from tugs too early, and 90 troop-filled gliders vanished forever into the sea. Paratroops jumped in 35-mile-an-hour winds and were scattered over huge distances. 11 aircraft loaded with British paratroopers were shot down by friendly gunners. Heroically, 83 determined British paratroopers crawled out of 12 gliders that got through and took a bridge targeted for a division. Elsewhere, scattered Allied airborne units disrupted German and Italian reinforcements. With the help of naval gun support, the beachhead held and the winning of Sicily was assured. After Sicily came the Allied airborne operations on the Italian mainland at Salerno and Anzio. But the campaign was largely another disappointment for American airborne forces, as they were used as ground soldiers rather than in their intended role. Meanwhile, Russian operations were having an equally tough time. A series of major drops in great force ultimately failed, such as those in early 1942 and along the Dnieper River in September of '43. However, the courage was great and the disruptive force of behind-the-lines operations considerable. Operations by paratroopers took place with in excess of 10,000 men in a single lift. But one paratroop operation dwarfed every previous effort. D-Day, the invasion of Fortress Europe through Normandy. The night sky of June the 6th, 1944 grew darker with a 2-hour-long passage of nearly 2,500 powered aircraft and almost 900 gliders. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions supported the Utah beach landings by seizing the key crossroads town of St. Mary-Glise. The British 6th Airborne landed east of Cayenne to secure vital water crossings and knock out big coastal guns that could devastate the beaches. The British operation was a masterpiece of courage and planning. Troopers landed on their targets with pinpoint accuracy and seized their objectives. But in the American sector, there was another enormous amount of scattered and misdropped paratroops. Marshes drowned scores of heavily laden troopers. St. Mary-Glise fell quickly, but the rest was a triumph of grit over execution. Objectives meant to be seized by 300 men were taken by 30. Units mingled, swapped assignments, desperately improvised. In 6 weeks of fighting, the American 82nd and the British 6th would take 74% casualties. The 101st lost 65%. In August 1944, 900 aircraft delivered American and British troopers into southern France in Operation Dragoon. This time, the precision was classic. Over 85% of all the paratroopers and gliders reached their objectives. Airborne contributed greatly to the rapid breakout from southern France. On June 29, 1950, Communist North Korean forces drove into South Korea. On October 20th, the 187th Airborne Division assaulted Sukchon and Suncheon in North Korea to cut off the communist retreat. Paratroopers were dropped by twin-boom Fairchild transports. By now, gliders had vanished. The reshaping of the world after 1945 left the old order of European empires in a shambles. Nowhere was this more evident after Korea than in France's involvement in her colonies in Indochina. During the fighting with the Viet Minh, France conducted over 150 airborne operations. Undoubtedly, the greatest of these was the attempt to relieve the siege at Dien Bien Phu. By building large fortified garrisons, it was hoped that the Viet Minh would be drawn into fighting conventional set-piece battles. In Operation Castor in late 1953, 5 parachute battalions were dropped into the Laos-Vietnam border over 4 days to capture the village at Dien Bien Phu. Their orders were to turn it into a fortress to be held with no thought of withdrawal, and at the same time to conduct offensive fighting patrols. During the weeks that followed, France put over 10,000 soldiers into the field, including 4 battalions of French Foreign Legionnaires, as well as North African tirailleurs and native Thai infantry. But the Viet Minh, led by the brilliant General Vo Nguyen Giap, had plans of their own. Their accurate and deadly artillery soon had the airstrip under constant and heavy bombardment. Giap was already assembling a force more numerous and far better armed and supplied than the French dreamed possible. By the beginning of March 1954, he had 3 infantry divisions at his disposal, supported by 105mm artillery guns, heavy mortars, and anti-aircraft guns of all calibers. The Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire was so heavy that civilian pilots resupplying the garrison refused to fly over what had become known as the chamber pot. The first blow came on 13 March 1954 when heavy Viet Minh artillery fire deluged the garrison, smashing in shelters and gun trenches. Then followed wave after wave of infantry assaults. By the next morning, one of the 8 outposts had fallen. A parachute battalion jumped in to reinforce the garrison, but this was not enough. During the ensuing weeks, the Vietnamese grip on the French tightened implacably. The only way to reach and support the shrinking outpost was from the air. 2 further parachute battalions were dropped on April 4 and 7 into an ever-decreasing garrison. The paratroopers almost immediately found themselves in action against a well-equipped enemy, but the efforts of the French airborne forces were largely in vain. By May 7th, it was all over. The French garrison, by now reduced to barely 1,000 men on their feet, eventually capitulated. 11,000 men went into captivity, 30 or 40% of whom were parachutists. It was the end of French rule in Vietnam, and all but the end of the parachutists. 7 battalions were sent to Dien Bien Phu, and none came back. By the mid-1950s, a new form of transport had arrived which would completely change the face of air assault: the helicopter. France was the first major power to develop the helicopter for this purpose, conducting operations and refining tactics during the war in Algeria. It was found that helicopters could quickly insert and extract soldiers into battle, as well as evacuate wounded troops. But it was in Vietnam that the helicopter was fully developed as an air assault weapon. There was only one major parachute operation in February 1967. The terrain and the elusive nature of the enemy soon turned the airborne battle over to a new force on the battlefield. In Vietnam, the helicopter emerged as a viable means of conducting military operations, both for delivery of troops and fire support. By marrying up airborne forces with helicopters, the concept of mobile or air assault forces was born. Suddenly, there were helicopters that could carry tanks, artillery, and most importantly, troops as unified forces. Reserves weren't needed because troops could be shuttled around the battlefield. Fitted with door-mounted guns, the helicopter could also provide its own fire support during an air assault, covering landings and withdrawals and suppressing resistance. And the aircraft that irrevocably changed the face of warfare in Vietnam was the Bell UH-1 Iroquois. Universally known as the Huey, on account of its designation, it did everything. Casualty evacuation, transport, gunship, airborne command post. But most importantly, it was the U.S. Army's major air assault helicopter, lifting entire battalions into battle, or covertly infiltrating small reconnaissance teams. But the Huey was soon replaced by the UH-60 Black Hawk. Much faster and far more powerful, it is now the U.S. Army's standard air assault helicopter. Along with 2 pilots and a crew chief, it can carry up to 20 troops, although 11 is the normal load. It can also lift a load of nearly 4 tons externally, such as a 105 howitzer. The twin-rotor Chinook is a medium-lift transport and air assault helicopter. 3 external cargo hooks give it great versatility, allowing it to carry multiple loads, such as artillery guns and vehicles. As an assault transport, its cabin can accommodate 55 troops. Paradrop cargo, as well as Special Forces soldiers and their equipment, can be offloaded from the rear ramp. The ubiquitous and versatile Hercules is the most widely used air assault transport aircraft in the world. It serves with nearly 60 air forces worldwide. For airborne operations, it carries 64 fully equipped paratroopers out to a distance of 1,100 kilometers for a combat drop. After Vietnam, American air assault operations were limited to conflicts in its own backyard. Operation Urgent Fury in 1983 was the campaign to restore order to Grenada. Helicopter air assaults by Army and Marine Corps units were backed up by airdrops of Rangers and paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division. The Rangers and the 82nd were back in action in 1989 during Operation Just Cause, the invasion of Panama. Landed by helicopter and parachute, 4 major task forces assaulted key targets in Panama City. They seized the main airport and the barracks of troops loyal to Panama's leader, General Noriega. Operation Uphold Democracy in October of '94 was the campaign to restore order to Haiti. A full-scale assault with 18,000 American troops had been planned to oust the military junta there, to have been spearheaded by the 82nd Airborne Division. A U.S. Joint Task Force was airborne in 61 C-130s and C-141s when the operation was called off at the last minute. The conflict was averted when Haiti's leader, General Cedras, agreed to stand down and let democratic elections take place. Airborne forces are inherently mobile and flexible units, and this ability to be rapidly deployed to trouble spots over the world is regularly practiced. They must be ready to fight in any terrain, from snow and ice to the jungle to the desert. During the 1980s, much useful desert training for the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions was carried out in Egypt in an exercise codenamed Bright Star. This experience was to be invaluable for Operation Desert Storm. In the era of multinational operations, it is common for the parachute troops of one country to be airlifted by aircraft of another power. The most graphic example of the success of airborne military operations involving the armed forces of many countries came during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, says one U.S. commander of the campaign to liberate Kuwait.
In Desert Storm, we had an example of the largest and longest air assault operation in military history. This involved the 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division. They took off from Saudi Arabia, went up to landing zones on the Euphrates River, only about 140 miles from Baghdad. Were able to do this in about 36 hours.
In a little over 50 years of conflict, airborne forces have proved themselves to be at the very cutting edge of military forces. Their high mobility enables them to deploy practically anywhere in the world at very short notice. And when they get there, they're ready for practically anything an enemy can throw at them.